Hi, my name is Michelle Miller, and I am the instructor for cell biology for health occupations this quarter. And this is the first chapter in your online textbook. So what we're going to do is I'm going to write out the lecture, and hopefully you'll have a piece of paper and something to write with, and you will be able to copy down my notes. I don't use PowerPoints. I like to kind of tell it and shape the lecture as a story. And it's also really important for you to learn how to take notes. And there's new evidence that suggests if you actually write down the information rather than just looking at PowerPoint slides, that you will be able to retain the information a lot more readily. So you'll be doing some writing this quarter as you watch the lectures. And also you can have your book open, or you could have, no, I guess you wouldn't want a web page open at the same time, but the images that I'm going to have in the lecture are in your textbook. So I'm going to share my desktop with you. And this is a starboard, which allows me to write fairly well. So I'd like to get, oh, there we go. It allows me to write fairly well. So hopefully you can read my handwriting. Sometimes this electronic pen can mess up and it can get a little bit difficult to read, but I'll try to do my best here. So this quarter, we are going to be introducing you to the human body and how we go about studying it. So this will be really important information to carry with you if you choose to go on to the 3-quarter sequence, Human Anatomy and Physiology, and that's a 200 level class. So this is for kind of the basic background information. We're going to be talking about cells, tissues. We're also going to get into some genetics and molecular genetics. So when we look at human biology, oftentimes it is broken down into anatomy. And this is the form. So this would be like, for example, looking at a heart and noticing that it has 4 chambers, and then maybe you have a diagram and you need to memorize all of the different structures and valves and vessels that bring blood into the heart and take it away. And that is all really important, but really it doesn't make much sense to study anatomy on its own without also understanding the physiology. So a lot of times students think the anatomy is a little bit easier because it's memorization, but the physiology is really important because it is the function. And so this is how our bodies are able to go about using physical and properties to move blood, for example. So it's kind of interesting when we look at our circulatory system, blood is pumped, but blood flows through the vessels depending on pressure differences. And also when we get gas exchange with our environment, when we breathe in and oxygen diffuses into our lungs, that all has to do with differences in the concentration of the gases inside our body as well as outside of our body. And so we have to understand the function. And so this oftentimes is the how, and it is more process driven. And sometimes students find that maybe this is a little bit more difficult, but to understand the actual processes, but it is very important. And so oftentimes we say that form follows function. So the only reason why we can understand why we have 4 chambers into our heart as opposed to 2 chambers like fish do would be to understand why the 4-chamber heart developed and what it allows in terms of allowing the complete separation of oxygenated versus unoxygenated blood in our body. Okay, so both of these are important. Also, when we look at human biology, we have terminology, and a lot of the terminology in biology is based upon root words. And so this is what people have who say, oh, I love science, but I have a hard time with biology, because in order to even understand your textbook or understand what I'm talking about, oftentimes we use words that you might not have heard of, but if you break them down into their roots, you would be able to understand what they are. So, for example, just a simple one that I'm sure everybody's heard of is arthritis. And so this arthro, this is joint. Right? So that has to do with anything that is the connection between two bones. The articulation between two bones is a joint. And sometimes joints are movable and sometimes they're not. Arthritis is specifically the study of the inflammation of the joints. So this is when, for some reason, there is increased blood flow, there could be extra fluid in the joint, and this is inflammation. So understanding itis, anytime you see itis, you know that it means inflammation. And anytime you see this word arthro or arthra, means that it has to do with joints. So it'll be really important for you to maybe make flashcards, or when you're trying to memorize the wording, the verbiage, the terms, or you could just start to use some of these terms in your everyday life. You could get together in study groups and you could use the terminology. And that is really important, because if you can explain the terminology to somebody else, it is much more likely that you are going to be able to remember that terminology yourself. Okay, so when we look at the living organism has different levels of organization. And so generally we call this the biological hierarchy of organization. So it starts generally at the most simplest, the basic building blocks of actually all matter on the planet would be atoms. And atoms consist of electrons and neutrons and protons. And we are going to get into the structure, the atomical structure, on the next chapter of the book. But if you look at living organisms, they are composed primarily of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and you could find these in a periodic table. These are the symbols for the elements. This is phosphorus, and this is sulfur. So it's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And this is acronym SHNOPS. So you can kind of remember that, as those are the primary elements, our atoms, that are found in our body. So when we look at the next level, we could say that we can talk about molecules. And sometimes in chemistry, they make the distinction between molecules and compounds. And we are not going to do that in biology. So we're going to say that molecules are atoms that are bonded to one another to make up a higher structure. So for example, we could have C6H12O6. And what these sub numbers mean is that there are 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. So this, because it has carbon in it, is an organic molecule. So this is an organic molecule. And, molecule. And it would be, for example, glucose. So this is the molecular formula for glucose, which is a very simple sugar that we use to produce energy. The next level of organization would be the inside the cells. We have, actually, let's just go to cells first. We have cells. So that's my next level of organization. And so cells are actually the fundamental unit of life. So what that means is that molecules are not considered living. So even organic molecules are not considered to be alive. So even enzymes, I know on some packaging, they say that enzymes are living, but what they really mean is that the enzymes are active. So they haven't been broken down or denatured. And so cells, unlike molecules, are living. And if we're going to talk about the characteristics of living in a few moments. The other next level would be tissues. So for example, we could have neurons. So this is my example. We could have neurons, and those are individual nerve cells. And then when we look at the tissues, this is a group of cells with the same structure and function. Right? So the cells being neurons, when you group them together and you say, oh, well, that is, say, for example, the spinal cord, then the spinal cord is made up of nervous tissue. Has inside of it nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is, inside almost all of our other organs. So for example, our digestive tract has nervous tissue in it, which allows the digestive system to contract and relax and move food through our body. The brain obviously has lots of nervous tissue. And then also our heart has nervous tissue. Even our bones have some nervous tissue in them. So when we look at the next level, this would be the organ. So this is really important because an organ has more than one type of tissue. So let's use the example that I just gave of the digestive system. So the stomach would be an organ, and the stomach is made up of muscle. So it's made up of muscle tissue, but it also has nervous tissue in it. And so because it has more than one type of tissue, then it is considered to be an organ. The next level of organization is the system. Okay? And these are organs that work together. So oftentimes when we're studying anatomy and physiology, we study systems. So we group, say, for example, all the digestive organs in the digestive system. So that would include the liver, the pancreas, the esophagus, the stomach, the large intestine, for example, would all be part of the digestive system. So we could say that this is a system. However, it's very important to realize that systems interact, and that is probably where we are the weakest in understanding of human biology, is this interaction between the systems. So for example, when we look at the interaction between the nervous system and the digestive system, oftentimes we don't understand that the digestive system has its own gut, they call it the gut brain. And that gut brain produces a lot of neurotransmitters, which can affect our rest of our body. So you might have heard of that, when you have a stomach ache or you have stomach issues or digestive issues, it can actually lead to depression because the digestive system releases its own serotonin. And serotonin is a really important nervous system in regulating, or neurotransmitter in regulating mood. And so you could talk about the gut brain, for example. So that would be interacting systems, and we don't have a level there for that. But then we have, finally, the organism, right? So this is the individual. So that would be how all the systems interact in order to allow us to survive, to get nutrients, to get rid of waste, and then to also grow, develop, and potentially reproduce, and then potentially die. And so that would be at the organism level. So in your book, there is a diagram here that shows these different levels. So it talks about the chemical level, which we have atoms, then we have molecules, then we have cells, tissues, organs, then we have the system. This would be the urinary system or the excretory system, and then the whole organism. So you need to be able to know the order in which these occur, from most simplest to most complex, and then examples. So what's an example, and we'll talk more about this, but what's an example of a cell or a molecule or an atom? So when in your book, it would probably be a good idea to review just briefly the different systems in the body. And you probably have some background in understanding these. So here are just a few of them. What does the muscle system allow you to do? It helps with movement, but also interesting, we're going to talk about this today, homeostasis, which is the maintenance of temperature. And then other systems are listed here. So you should know, like if I said, what system is responsible for releasing hormones, you would say that would be the endocrine system. Okay, so primarily responsible for releasing the hormones in the body. Okay, so let's look at the functions of human life. And this goes along with that hierarchy of biological organization, because the first one is that we have an organization. So this is kind of like, what are the characteristics of living things? And the first thing is they have organization. And the main reason for this organization is that this is to maintain order. Because one of the fundamental properties of our universe is that if you don't put energy into maintaining order, things will go to a state of disorder. So things tend to become more disorganized. And so we have to use energy to maintain that order. So we must use energy to maintain order or our organization. Okay. Along with this organization is that we have boundaries. And so boundaries help to maintain order. So fundamentally at the cellular level, it is the cell membrane. So for example, the cell membrane regulates, using some energy, what comes in and what leaves the cell. Right? So when we die and we stop obtaining energy, we decompose. And so cells fall apart, and then our body just kind of will eventually, with the help, hopefully, of microorganisms, will decompose, but we will lose our organization. So boundaries are important, order, to maintaining order, and that it requires energy. The second thing is that we have metabolism. And this goes along with having to obtain energy, because we can have two different types of metabolism. So we can have what is called anabolism, and this is building molecules. So for example, I can take in protein amino acids, and I can build my own proteins. So my proteins are made up of amino acids. If I eat amino acids, I'll be able to build my proteins. So that is building of structure. So you might have seen this word before. Think anabol and think, oh, anabolic steroids. And you're thinking, when somebody takes anabolic steroids, that helps to build muscle. Okay, so that's a word, a root word that might, if you make some associations with other words, might be helpful. We also have catabolism. And I think of catastrophe here. I'm not sure what but catabol means breaking down of molecules. So it's actually quite amazing because we undergo a recycling of the atoms that are in our body so that we're constantly breaking down molecules and then taking in new nutrients and building new molecules. So we're not static. Even when we think about our skeletal system, our bones are completely rebuilt like every 5 years. So we break down the molecules and the cells in our bones, and then we produce new ones. And so metabolism is a characteristic of life. We also have responsiveness. And when you think about responsiveness, you generally think about responding to external stimuli, but we also respond to internal stimuli. So we have external versus internal. So external, we'll talk about, could be, for example, temperature. Internal could be glucose levels. Okay. So glucose is oftentimes used to produce energy to maintain order. And when our glucose levels drop, it makes us feel really bad and can actually cause us to go into coma. But if they get excessively high, it also causes problems with the nervous system. And so glucose levels are an internal factor that the body responds to. It responds to internal, we'll put factors, as well as external factors. And then we have movement, which is the job specifically of the muscular system. And even plants have some ability to move. And then we have development. So starting embryonically, growth, and reproduction. And we'll talk more about these as we progress in the class. So you could say that these are the characteristics of something that is alive. They all have to have this in order to be alive. So if we look at some of the requirements for human life, sometimes we could refer to these as the survival needs. What do we need in order to be able to survive? One of the things that we need are nutrients, because we need to grow, right? So we need to grow and develop. So when we look at nutrients, we could be talking about proteins, for example. Okay. And so proteins, like we'll talk about in our hair and our skin, would be structural proteins. And we take them in and we use them to build our body. We also need oxygen. And the reason why we need oxygen, it's a very interesting reason, but it is how we obtain energy. And so we have a type of chemical reaction metabolism in our body that is called cellular respiration. And so when you think about respiration, you think about breathing, and this is at the cellular level. So the whole reason why you inhale and exhale all the time on a regular basis is that you need to feed your cells oxygen. And you also need to get rid of the waste product from this chemical reaction, which is carbon dioxide. So if we look at this chemical reaction, we can take a glucose molecule, which I introduced previously, and you can combine it with oxygen. And so this would be 6 oxygen molecules. So O2 is oxygen gas that we have in our atmosphere. And then we can produce, as a byproduct, 6 carbon dioxides, which is waste. We breathe that out, and then plants take that up. And 6 water, plus ATP. And this ATP is energy. Okay. And so this takes place inside of our cells. And this ATP is a common currency. You can kind of think of it as an exchange currency. So here we're feeding our cells glucose and oxygen, and we're getting ATP. And ATP is what muscle cells use to contract. It's also what nerve cells use to initiate an impulse. So this is the common currency, and we'll talk about what that means when we get to chemistry, what ATP stands for. But you just need to know that that is the common currency. That's the energy. Okay. So that's cellular respiration. That is why we have to have oxygen, okay, is in order to produce ATP. We also need water. And water is important for a variety of reasons. One reason is that it is considered to be a universal solvent. So what does that mean? That means that almost everything in our that we need to transport in our body is transported in solution. And so if you look at a solution, a chemical solution like sugar water, for example, it is the solute, and the solute is dissolved in a solvent so it can be transported. And so if we look at sugar water, for example, and this would be like our solute could be table sugar, which is sucrose, not glucose, plus water, right? So you can make a solution. And what happens is that the water molecules actually adhere to the sucrose molecules and they pull them apart. And so you go from crystal form to actually not even being able to see it in solution unless, and not even be able to detect it unless you tasted it, for example, okay? So it is a universal solvent. That is one of the main reasons why we have it, okay? We lose water from our body in the form of sweat and urine, and we also lose it via evaporation when we breathe. And so if you, like in the wintertime, when you have, if you have a wood stove or if you have really dry heat, you have to drink more water in order to get more, in order to, because you're breathing it in and it's being lost as evaporation. Okay, when we look at another characteristic of life, of humans, is that we have a range of temperature that we need to maintain. And in Celsius, this is 37 degrees Celsius, which is that 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The importance of temperature is that these chemical reactions, this metabolism that occurs in our body at all times, including cellular respiration, these chemical reactions must take place at a particular temperature. So they occur best at a certain temperature. And what happens if you increase the temperature too low, low temperature slows down molecules so that they don't interact. So if we look at too low, we'll put too low, molecules slow down. So they don't interact with one another to allow the chemical reaction to take place. Too high, it can actually change the structure of the molecules. And specifically, we're going to talk about enzymes. So enzymes can be permanently affected by high temperatures, which is why when we preserve food or when we cook food, we use high temperatures because it denatures or changes the structure of proteins and specifically enzymes so that the food will be stay preserved, right? Or we can actually also kill microorganisms when we heat it, but this changes the structure of the molecule so that the chemical reaction does not take place. The last one is kind of interesting. The last example is atmospheric pressure. Oops, I went the wrong way, am I? Okay. So the last requirement or survival need is atmospheric pressure. So this is measured in millimeters of mercury. And you might have heard of like barometric readings that measures atmospheric pressure. And at sea level, the standard atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, right? So what this pressure does is it allows for gas exchange. And so oxygen has to be at a higher pressure outside than inside in order for it to move in. So this allows for gas exchange in the lungs. So oxygen moves from a high to a low pressure, right? So if your oxygen levels are too low, say you're climbing a really high mountain, your oxygen levels are too low, you're not going to be able to get enough oxygen into your body to fuel cellular respiration. So you pass out and you die. So you would take oxygen gas with you if you're having to go on a hike that would take you to a elevation or an altitude that is too high. And so that oxygen, by using oxygen gas, you would be able to survive that change in atmospheric pressures. Okay, so those are the requirements for life. Okay, so let's go back to one of the characteristics of life is organization. And this is what is referred to as homeostasis. And homeostasis is really interesting because it is the mechanism, it is the physiology of how our bodies work. And when we have a homeostatic imbalance, that is what will lead to disease. So homeo literally means same. So it means same state. Stasis means state. Same state. Recently, they kind of rethought this whole idea of homeostasis, and they now like to think of it as a dynamic equilibrium. Meaning that we have a set point for whatever characteristic, like glucose levels in the blood is a set point. And the dynamic is that we fluctuate around that set point. And this allows for responsiveness to the environment. So, for example, if I have a fight or flight incident, if my sympathetic nervous system causes me to become really energized and responsive, like I need to run or I need to fight, then my glucose levels are going to increase. If I am not in that situation, then my glucose levels should stay pretty calm. But we need to be able to fluctuate around that set point, around that homeostatic set point in order to respond to the environment. And so if we have the inability to respond, say, for example, heart rate is another really good example of this. If your heart rate stayed exactly the same, like homeostasis, 75 beats per minute, what would happen if you tried to climb a set of stairs? You would not be able to keep up with the oxygen demand. And so you'd have to slow down and you'd have to rest. And so that happens to a lot of people that are on medication for rapid heartbeat, for example, beta blockers, is that they can't, their hearts don't respond to increased need for oxygen. And so they actually have a disease, and it's not, the body's not responding. So it's not a dynamic equilibrium, okay? So when we look at this ability to stay at a set point, we have a mechanism that is called the negative feedback mechanism. And this negative is not a bad thing, right? So it's actually, it's not in terms of like, it's a bad thing, right? It just means that the response is going to decrease the stimulus. So the response to the stimulus that the body has decreases rather than increases the stimulus. And so that helps to maintain order. So let's look at an example. I'm going to draw just a circular drawing here where we have a stimulus. And then we have the stimulus is picked up by a receptor that then sends it to a control center. The control center then sends it out to what is called an effector. So think receptor, think effector. And then the effector decreases the stimulus. Actually, sorry, response, we'll put response. Decreases stimulus. Right? And so we have this feedback mechanism that helps to maintain a set point. So if we look at, for example, glucose levels, so the stimulus is, let's say we have high glucose levels. So this could be just a naturally occurring situation, normally occurring situation where I don't eat all day and then I eat a candy bar and my glucose levels go really high. There's receptors that actually detect that high glucose level, and they're actually in the control center, which is the pancreas. And the pancreas in this case is also the effector. And the pancreas then responds by releasing insulin. And what insulin does is it causes the liver and other tissues to take glucose out of the blood. So we put glucose is removed from blood in the responding to insulin. Okay, and what that does is that gets me back to a normal set point. So the set point could be like right in here. Right, that's my set point for blood glucose levels, which is milligrams per milliliter of blood. I think it's 90 milligrams per milliliter of blood. Okay, so that's a negative feedback mechanism. Now, there's two pathways that you need to be familiar with. And I'm going to write in blue. Hopefully everybody can see this. So this is what is called the afferent pathway. So that goes to the control center. Now from the control center where we have, in this case, they're both the same. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes the control center is the brain, but in this case, it's the pancreas is both. This is called the efferent pathway. Okay, so A comes before E. So just remember afferent and efferent. This will be really important when you get to studying the different systems. And looking at how homeostasis regulates the dynamic equilibrium in all of those different systems. Digestion, nervous system, neurotransmitter release, etc. Okay. So in your book, you want to look at thermoregulation. So another example of this is thermoregulation. So we are endotherms versus ectotherms. So I'll put versus ectotherms. I'm going to run out of room here. Okay, so we're endotherms versus ectotherms. So endo means that we use metabolism to regulate a constant body temperature rather than the environment. So think a lizard, for example, could sunbathe on a hot rock and become very warm-blooded, maybe even hot-blooded, but they're still ectotherms, even though they are warm from the sun. So the use of warm-blooded and cold-blooded is not very appropriate in that particular instance to regulate body temperature. And this is just one strategy, right? If I'm an ectothermic organism, I actually don't have to take in as many nutrients because I'm using the environment to heat my body. But endotherms have an advantage in that they can remain active even under cold temperature. So temperature does not regulate or tend to affect our activity levels unless it's extreme. So when we look at this, we can see that we can lose heat if the body temperature rises. The response is coordinated by the brain, and so the brain would be the control center. The blood vessels dilate, we sweat, we evaporate, and then heat is lost. And so this is a negative feedback, right? Because this response to the stimulus decreases the stimulus and brings us back to that 37 degrees Celsius. And then we can also shiver, because shivering is a form of metabolism that generates heat, and that helps to warm the body, and heat is retained. So this would be negative feedback. If we look at positive feedback in contrast to negative, it's not any better. Actually, we have very few examples of positive feedback in our bodies, and it can also run the system out of control. So this does not promote homeostasis. Okay, so positive means that the response to the stimulus increases stimulus. Okay, so the example that your book gives is labor. And so if we look at this diagram here, so the stimulus is actually the baby pushing its head against the cervix. This actually causes more hormone to be released, which makes the contractions even harder. The uterus contracts and it presses the baby's head even harder against the cervix. And so this will lead to an outcome. So the positive feedback mechanism will only end once the baby has left the uterus and has started to move through the birth canal. So oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. This is the stimulus, is the head, right? The response, this is the control center, is the brain. The response is that the more oxytocin is released, which is a hormone that causes the uterus to contract, right? And this causes harder contractions, or contractions become more frequent and stronger. Right? So this actually increases the stimulus so that the baby pushes harder against the cervix. So homeostasis is a super important, and that idea of the negative feedback mechanism is super important in understanding physiology and the function and the how of how our body maintains order in various systems. Okay, so the last topic I'm going to talk about is anatomical orientation and then the terminology. So when we look at anatomical orientation, there are words that you're going to need to learn how to use that are really important in giving directions, and specifically really important in medical terminology. So an understanding, like the anterior versus the posterior side of the heart. What does that mean? Okay, so anterior is front. Sometimes it's also referred to as ventral. So anterior ventral, ventral means belly, and that's the front, okay? Posterior is the back, and it is also sometimes referred to as dorsal. So for example, our spinal cord is dorsal to our digestive tract. Our trachea, our windpipe, is anterior to our esophagus. So these are relative terms, like how you would use them, right? Anterior, posterior, there's other examples in your book. We also have cranial. So that would be toward head. And then tail, towards the tail, is caudal. Right? Towards the head, towards the tail. We also have terms like distal, which is further away from the center, and I'll give you an example of that in a second, and proximal, which is closer. Distal and proximal. We have superior, which is above, and inferior, which is below. So these are all words that we're going to have lots of practice using. And in your book, oh, I forgot one. So the other one, so let's just look at these. We have right and left. We have proximal. So let's say the shoulder is more proximal compared to the elbow. The fingers are more distal than the elbow. So I'd say distal to the elbow are the fingers. Proximal to the elbow would be the shoulder. We have anterior, posterior, cranial, caudal, above, below. They don't have that one on there. Medial is towards the center. And lateral is towards the side. So notice when this person is standing, this is what is referred to as anatomical position. So we would say that the thumb is lateral compared to the pinky, and the pinky is medial. The reason why we have our palms facing out like this is the orientation of the two forearm bones, the radius and the ulna. They are not crossed here. When we turn it so that our hand, you can try this standing up, When you turn it so that your palm faces backwards and you feel your forearm, those bones actually cross. And that's called pronation versus supination. So those are terms that we'll get used to using. These are also important terminology. We have here all of the regional terms. And so, for example, when we talk about the shoulder region, that is actually referred to as the acromial region. When we talk about the wrist region, that would be the carpal region. When we talk about, say, for example, calf, that's called sural or sura. The heel is called the calcaneus. Now you're like, well, why do I have to know all these different words? Why can't I just say heel? When you learn these terms, then the bones and the muscles will make a lot more sense, because the calcaneus is actually, that is the name of the bone. That is your heel bone. And so when we talk about the wrist as being carpal, that is what the name of those bones are in the wrist. It's carpus right here. And so it is actually really useful. And we'll have some time to go through these, and you're going to need to learn most of these terms for the exam. Okay, so in dissection, and sometimes when we're looking at slides, we talk about different body planes, and that is how you cut the body in different planes in order to visualize the inside of the body, or maybe even the inside of the structure. So if you're talking about like, oh, let's cut open the heart, which plane are you going to cut the heart open, and what is going to be the difference is what you're going to see, okay? So the body planes in the sections, there's a diagram that shows these. So if you look at sagittal, sagittal means separating right and left. And if you cut it exactly down the middle, that is what is referred to as mid-sagittal. So when we dissect the brain and I say, do a mid-sagittal cut in the brain, you would know, oh, I'm going to cut the brain down the middle, separating the two hemispheres, right? Instead, like if you wanted to do a frontal cut on the brain, that would actually allow you to see the gray and white matter better. And so frontal would be along this plane where you have, just remember the front and the back. Sometimes that's called coronal, because if this person was wearing a crown, that's where it would sit, okay? And then oftentimes you see these really interesting images of the body with transverse planes. And so it'd be like cutting you down the middle, and then what they would do is that they would show you what the inside of the body looked like. And so like right here, that would be, you would probably see multiple sections through the digestive tract right there. And then the abdominal cavity, which has coelomic fluid in it, has filled with fluid. And so the organs kind of reside in a body cavity. We can also talk about the body cavities. And so this is something that you should study. We have the dorsal body cavity. So interestingly, our nervous system, unlike say, for example, in earthworms, is in the back of the body. So it is dorsal. So it is posterior. And you can see the cranial and the vertebral cavities. When we look at an earthworm, their nervous system actually runs down the ventral side of their body. Then we have the thoracic, that's the heart and the lungs. That is separated by a muscle, which is the diaphragm. And that diaphragm is really important in respiration. Then we have the abdominal cavity, right? And then down here, really protected by that bony pelvis, is the pelvic cavity. Now, one of the really interesting things about these cavities is that they are lined with a very slippery membrane that produces fluid. And so the example that we're going to look at is the heart. And so the membranes in our body are referred to as serous membranes. And they have 2 layers. And so an example of this is the pericardium. We'll just put pericardial sac. Okay, so this is my example. Okay, so think of it as a sac, so it's got 2 layers. So the part of the membrane that is attached to the heart is called the visceral pericardium. So this is attached to the heart directly. And then we have the parietal pericardium. And so visceral means think organ, right? So visceral is used a lot. Parietal means not the organ, but out to the side. So that would be the parietal pericardium. And this is attached to the outside of the body cavity. Right? And so in between here is what is called serous fluid. And so in the case of the pericardium, peri means around, cardium means heart. In the case of this fluid allows for friction-free movement of the heart. Our lungs have a separate one, which is called the pleural cavity or the pleural sac. Then our abdominal organs also have a separate one, which is called the peritoneum. Okay, so allows for friction-free movement of heart. And this is described in chapter 1 of your book. And there is an image here. Okay, so this is the cavity, which is filled with fluid. The visceral is on the inside. The parietal is on the outside. And then we have the space that's filled with fluid. And the heart sits in that space. And so when the heart contracts and then relaxes, it moves in this space. And sometimes you can get excess fluid or not enough fluid. And then that causes the heart to not work very well. And it also causes a lot of pain. Okay, so that is all the information in chapter 1 of your textbook for cell biology. And the next lecture will be on chapter 2, inorganic chemistry, and then organic chemistry.